Hello, everyone. Welcome to Journalism 205, Multimedia Journalism. Dr. Shermak here. Hope you're having a awesome day, an awesome day, I should say. Uh, Today's episode, podcasting. All right, podcasting. And this is one of my favorite topics because I love podcasts. I still don't know how people find the time to listen to so many of them. It kind of amazes me. But I'm working on that. I tend to listen to them in my car. You may have, you know, places where you listen to them. Maybe it's around the house, maybe it's walking around town or around campus, doing housework, whatever it is. They're popular and they're growing, and they certainly are a form of journalism today, a form of multimedia journalism, and sort of the most recent evolution of audio journalism. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. So the goal is to give you a broad overview of podcasting and audio storytelling, and talk a little bit about the relationship between those two, and give you some idea as to why we're covering it here in this class and why that's important. So we'll dig into that today and talk a little bit about how that applies to us here and what you can expect going forward. So as I mentioned, I'm an avid podcast listener. I enjoy listening to podcasts on, a lot of my favorite topics: politics, sports, news, all sorts of things. And I think one of the reasons that I love them so much is, quite frankly, they remind me a lot of talk radio. And I listened to a lot of talk radio growing up, particularly sports talk radio. And they've taken so much of the elements of talk radio and sort of mainstreamed them and made them, about they're talking about things on these podcasts that couldn't have been discussed on radio airwaves because there's topics that maybe just don't have that enough audience to garner enough listeners for advertisement, so on and so forth. So podcasts got really popular when they started exploring some more of these niche areas that just weren't ever going to make it onto the radio necessarily, because of maybe their perceived or actual popularity. So that's been a really cool way for a number of different topics to be put into our media landscape, through this vehicle for podcasting. And it's become a lot easier for us to create podcasting because, as I think you will learn in this class, the threshold to actually producing one and getting it up on the air, if you will, out on the internet, is not all that difficult, right? And that's one of the great things about them. So, let's just talk a little bit about definitions. If we think about audio storytelling as a um, broad category. The podcast, I think, is a type of audio storytelling, right? Audio storytelling, one of the best examples, and I actually used to teach this at the University of Texas in a class called Audio Storytelling, which has now been rebranded as podcasting, interestingly enough. But you're thinking about like an audio story, sort of like an NPR style story, where you have natural sound, you have interviews, you have people, talking, other your subjects talking on those pieces. They're like little news stories, but in an audio only form. We can do those same things in podcasting. It's just that podcasting now, um, typically is more about a series and like one topic, or consistently has hosts, so on and so forth. So, podcasts are more of a longer term series that's maybe done weekly or even daily for some of them. Some of the news podcasts I listen to are daily, from like NPR and the New York Times, so on and so forth. So these are more consistent, a little bit longer, so on and so forth. If you also dig podcasts, you are not alone. The numbers have increased. These are the most recent numbers from Pew Research Center, 2025, their study of podcasts. And you can go back and look at historical data. Um, I would say like the bar here is sort of either sometimes or often. Adults who say they listen to podcasts sometimes or often is about 22%. 10% say often. 10 years prior to this, back in 2015, that number was probably down, I would say, in like the maybe like the 12% range, something like that. So they've increased in popularity dramatically. They're still not what most people listen to, but they're very lucrative because one of the major keys with podcasts is that they have a very loyal audience, right? And it's the kind of loyal audience we actually saw with radio in its heyday, especially talk radio in its heyday, which was kind of the 80s and 90s. Back then, AM talk radio, a lot of loyalty, listen every single day, so on and so forth. We're seeing that come back around with podcasting. So, as I always say, if you've taken or you plan to take the Journalism 200 class, Introduction to Mass Communication, we also talk about podcasts there, and we talk about how history repeats itself and the loyalty that we saw with radio programs in certain eras, we're now seeing that loyalty again with podcasts. So, in a sense, this isn't really something new, but the way that these are delivered and our access to them is something new, right? So, I just want to talk a little bit about my experience with podcasting. Back when I was in the doctoral program, um, at the University of Texas at Austin. I happened to be there when they started their own, what they call audio production house, the Drag. And the Drag is, I know it sounds depressing, but it actually refers to an area of Austin that's adjacent to campus. And the Drag was really one of the first um, uh, podcast studios set up at a university in the country, and it was really exciting to be a part of that. Some of the students I taught in the audio storytelling class went on to found the Drag, and the first podcast they created in cooperation with the NPR affiliate there, KUT 90.5 on your FM dial, was the Orange Tree podcast. And the Orange Tree podcast falls right into that very popular true crime genre of podcasts. And it was about a murder that took place at the Orange Tree Apartments, just right near campus there in Austin. Still a great listen, still available on all your podcast platforms if you like that genre and you want to check it out. But it was really fun to be there with students who were at the time kind of experimenting with this and then producing amazing content. And they did a really great job and continue to do a good job to this day. So check them out. You can get their podcasts anywhere and follow them on social media. I then had my own podcast venture when I was teaching at Orange Coast College and faculty advisor to the Coast Report there, which was a student newspaper. And we actually started our own podcast studio. And that was really exciting. We were able to get a grant for the equipment and set this up on campus. And we started our first podcast, which was called Scuttlebutt, which is a reference to the pirate mascot there at Orange Coast College. And Scuttlebutt was a news podcast that was done weekly and went over the campus news, kind of in an Up First on NPR format. If you listen to Up First, that was really fun. Since I've been at Cuesta, we've dabbled a bit in podcasting, but I would love to do more. And if you're interested in doing more, there are opportunities here. We actually have a podcasting class on campus through FTVE, which is Film, Television, and Electronic Media. There's an opportunity there. So check that out. And if you have any questions on it, please let me know. But you certainly could join our student newspaper here and do podcasts if that's something that you dig. So why do podcasts, why are they so popular? Why do we love them so much? Um, why do we even care to study them or do them? Well, I think they really offer expanded opportunities for storytelling. There's so many creative ways to share audio, right? And you hear that when you listen to true crime, you hear that when you listen to some humor there, so on and so forth. There's a lot of opportunities for that. So I love the creativity involved. That's part of what makes them popular. Another thing that makes them popular is really quite simple, and that is being able to listen to them when we want. right? This is a concept called time shifting. It's what initially made VCRs very popular because people could record television shows and then watch them whenever they wanted, or they could go rent a movie and watch them whenever they wanted. And that sort of freedom and agency over media consumption carried over many, many years forward from VCRs to DVRs to streaming to, binge watching shows and now into podcasting. And it's really easy to transmit these to your audience. You just need a web connection. And there's a lot of platforms out there that will host these. There's ways to get them on your mobile phone, of course. So it's just this really efficient, kind of plug and play way to create a radio show without having to have a radio station to blast it out to the universe. And that's really exciting. Putting together a topic. I love this cartoon. Um, it says, so there were three generic white dudes with average experiences and opinions. It says, OS, did we just start a podcast? Yes, three white dudes with a microphone. We just started a podcast. I know that's a joke, but a lot of people think it's that easy, and it is not. It might be easy to put together a meh, mid, so and so podcast, but to do a good one, it requires strategy. It requires a topic, it requires a plan, it requires the right technology, and it requires some way of distributing it. So I know people get excited and be like, oh my God, we should start a podcast. I've literally had these conversations with my friends. The truth is, there's much more involved, and I want to discuss that a little bit today. So when you have a topic, you're not just riffing you're not just riffing on something, right? That's what we think. Oh, I can just set a couple microphones in front of us and we can just talk and there we go. And some podcasts you listen to might sound like that, but trust me, there's a lot of planning and discussion behind that, right? And you might have where they go off topic, like one of my favorite podcasts is Smartless, and that topic that podcast is super silly and they go all over the place. But there's some planning in advance, right? There's some idea of who they're talking to, who they're interviewing, so on and so forth. So, one thing that I would suggest if you're thinking about a podcast is focus it on a narrow topic. It limits the amount of time you need to spend because you don't cover every single thing. The length of podcast is important. I know some of you are out there who are like, yeah, I'll dig in on like a 1 or 2 hour podcast, but most successful podcasts are in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 minutes. Um, you have an audience who is very much distracted by all the other things in the world and all the other media in the world. So, make that a priority to keep it within a reasonable time. Do the simple things better. Make sure your audio is clear. Make sure that your sound is good. Those are going to draw them. Podcasts are a really simple media. They really are. It's sound. And I don't, that's not putting down audio because it's difficult to develop and do well. But at the end of the day, you're just going into people's ears, right? And so do that simple stuff better. And I would also say podcasts, the more journalistic we can get with our podcasts, the better. That means doing some interviewing, doing some research, doing some reporting, and building that into the podcast. That's going to make for a better product rather than just sitting down and riffing on something. Make a plan. I always tell students, treat your podcast like a story. If you come along and you want to do a podcast for our student newspaper, I'm going to ask you for some information ahead of time. I want to pitch. I want to know what sources either you're going to bring on the podcast or talk to beforehand. I want to hear about some organization around a central topic. It takes some forethought there to make a successful one. If you're generating or planning an idea, if you're wanting to generate an idea, think about asking yourself these questions. What am I curious about? What kind of story can I explore with audio? Some stories are better explored with photo or video, but there's others that lend themselves very well to audio. And how can I maximize that audio while storytelling? In other words, can I go out and find what they call nat sound, natural sound that I could bring into the story? Can I go out and find subjects who are willing to go on the microphone and talk to be included on this podcast? And then create, even if it's very loose, sort of a script for the show. And it doesn't have to be written word for word. In fact, it sounds more natural when it isn't. But if you have sort of an idea where things are headed, you become more organized and more professional, and it makes for a better listen. We need to establish trust with our audience, just like we do with any journalism. And having a more organized, thought out podcast will do that. Technology. Um, I think the first big thing you need to get to make a good podcast is a good microphone. All right. There are good microphones on our mobile phones, and I know we have a major focus on that in this class. For what you need to do in this class, uh, your phone microphone is just fine. But if you're wanting to take this next level, if you're wanting to continue this seriously going forward, I would invest in a microphone. The good news is that the costs on those are coming down, and there's a lot of really good ones out there. And if you need any, help with those, please, I'm happy to offer my 2 cents. The main idea here, and this has been true in audio for all sorts of years, or all the years essentially, is dirty sound in, dirty sound out. If you have bad audio that goes in, it's super hard to clean that up to make it sound really any good. So try to control your environment as much as possible. Your elements, so on and so forth. You'd be amazed at how when you're inside of a room, it might seem quiet, but then you record the audio and you listen to it later and it's picking up, an HVAC system or some other kind of humming going on in the room. Or when you're outside, you're picking up the wind. Try your best to make that audio as good as you can from the jump so you don't have to come in and do some, Wizard of Oz magic with your audio in the editing phase. The editing phase does involve software. You have access, as we've talked about throughout the class, to the Adobe suite. That would be Adobe Audition. I think it's an excellent piece of software, but there's a little bit of a learning curve, and we have those tutorials here in this class to help you. But there's other great ones out there. There's some that are just right on your mobile phone that you can use. Audacity is another one that is an excellent free software that does a good job with audio. Even just like a simple GarageBand on Apple, can do well too. So make sure to look at our Canvas site for those Adobe tutorials as well as the alternatives to Adobe that we have. And to make it more professional, yeah, start to play with it a little bit more beyond just voice. Add music, add some background sounds, some natural sounds, so on and so forth. And we have videos in the class here to help you do that. Distributing your work is another challenge in podcasting. Um, we've talked all along about how, social media and digital technology has become a way for journalists to get content to their audience. That's the number one goal. And it's probably the most important purpose that it has served so far. So, how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of existing platforms that are already um, dialed into people's ears, things like Spotify and Apple and SoundCloud. Those are all out there for people to listen to. So find those and distribute everywhere you can. And start looking for new platforms. I just stumbled upon one called Hark that I was looking at. There's a few other new ones out there from time to time that are coming along. As audio becomes more lucrative, there's going to be more platforms. That's just the way it works. Follow the money, right? Make sure, though, you're promoting through social media and other established mechanisms. So, for example, if we publish a podcast for the Questonian, we also put that up on our website, questonian.com. Even though people may not look at that as a podcast website, they do look at it as a source of news from the Questonian, and a podcast is just that. So it should be there. And the Questonian has a Spotify channel, so on and so forth. So um, that's really important is even though these are new technologies, make sure to distribute them in places where people are finding more of your legacy work and they can access them, like putting a QR code in print, for example. Make sure to do that. So Again, this was just a super quick overview. There's going to be more content in the module for podcasting, so make sure to take a look at that. But I just wanted to jump on and talk to you about it a little bit today. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, ask on Canvas, or shoot me an email, Jeremy_Shermak at Cuesta.edu. I'm always happy to discuss these topics, and I'm always happy to hear new suggestions for podcast shows. So there's a lot of them out there, and sometimes they're not as easy to discover as one might think. So if you ever want to talk about those or send along some suggestions, please do. I'd love to have that conversation. Thanks so much for joining us here for Multimedia Journalism. Dr. Shermack signing off. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.